The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Montana ranch as Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching her mother prepare lunch with the same careful precision she brought to everything. At 26, Sarah had inherited her mother's delicate features and determined spirit, but carried the weight of worry that seemed to settle deeper into her shoulders each passing day. Moved through their small farmhouse kitchen like a dancer, her movements graceful despite the calluses on her hands from years of hard work. At 48, she possessed a quiet beauty that seemed untouched by time, her dark hair still thick and lustrous, her smile still capable of lighting up a room. Yet Sarah noticed how her mother's eyes held a loneliness that no amount of busy work could chase away. The family had come to Valley 5 years ago, after Sarah's father passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Had sold everything they owned in California to buy this small property on the outskirts of the ranching community, determined to start fresh and build something new. She had dreams of growing vegetables and herbs, maybe starting a small business selling to the local restaurants. Those dreams had slowly materialized into reality. His garden was now the most productive in the valley, her vegetables sought after by every restaurant within 50 miles. She had built a reputation for reliability and quality that commanded respect from even the most traditional ranchers. But success in business hadn't translated to happiness in her personal life. Sarah watched her mother hum softly while chopping vegetables, the same Vietnamese lullaby she used to sing when Sarah was small. The melody always made Sarah's heart ache because she knew her mother sang it when she felt alone. Despite being surrounded by neighbors and customers who genuinely liked and respected her, remained isolated in ways that went deeper than language or culture. The knock at the front door interrupted Sarah's thoughts. She opened it to find Jake standing on their porch, his weathered cowboy hat in his hands. Jake owned the largest ranch in the valley, a sprawling operation that had been in his family for 4 generations. At 52, he was a man who commanded respect through quiet strength rather than loud words. "Morning, Sarah," Jake said, his voice carrying that distinctive Western drawl that seemed to make every word sound unhurried. "Is your mother around? I wanted to talk to her about possibly expanding our vegetable order for the ranch hands." Sarah studied Jake's face, noting how his eyes seemed to search past her into the house. This was the 3rd time this month he had found a reason to visit their farm, and each time his business could have easily been conducted over the phone. Jake was not a man who made unnecessary trips. "She's in the kitchen," Sarah replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "Mom, Mister is here about the vegetable order." Appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw Jake, her face brightened with a smile that made her look years younger. "Mister, please come in. Would you like some tea?" "That's very kind, Mrs., but I don't want to take up too much of your time," Jake replied, though he made no move to leave. "I was hoping we could discuss increasing our weekly order. The men have been asking specifically for more of your tomatoes and that spicy cucumber salad you make." Sarah watched the interaction with growing understanding. Her mother's posture straightened when Jake was around, and she seemed to take extra care with her appearance on days when his ranch truck might appear in their driveway. Jake, for his part, seemed to find excuses to linger, asking detailed questions about growing techniques that Sarah suspected he already knew the answers to. After Jake left with promises to send one of his hands to pick up the larger order, Sarah decided it was time for an honest conversation. She found her mother in the garden, tending to the late-season tomatoes with unusual intensity. "Mom, can we talk?" Sarah asked, settling beside her mother on the wooden bench her father had built years ago. Looked up from the tomato plants, her hands still busy with pruning. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would require delicate handling. Her mother had pride that ran deeper than mountain roots, and any suggestion that she needed help or companionship had to be approached carefully. "I've been thinking about your life here, Mom, about how hard you've worked to build this business and make a place for us in this community." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I worry that you're so focused on taking care of everyone else that you're not taking care of yourself." His hands stilled in their work. "I don't understand what you mean." "When was the last time you did something just for you? When was the last time you had a conversation about something other than vegetables or business?" Sarah turned to face her mother directly. "When was the last time you let someone take care of you instead of the other way around?" A flush crept up her neck, and she returned to her pruning with renewed vigor. "I don't need anyone to take care of me, Sarah. We've done just fine on our own." "I know we have, Mom. You've been incredible, but doing fine on your own doesn't mean you have to stay alone forever." Sarah reached out to still her mother's busy hands. "Dad wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life by yourself." Tears gathered in his eyes, and she finally looked at her daughter. "It's not that simple, sweetheart. I'm not young anymore. I'm a widow with a grown daughter trying to run a business in a place where I'm still seen as an outsider by many people. Who would want to take on all of that?" Sarah's heart broke a little at the vulnerability in her mother's voice. This was the conversation she had been dreading but knew they needed to have. Her mother's assumption that she was undesirable, that her circumstances made her a burden rather than a blessing, revealed just how isolated she had become. "Mom, you're one of the most beautiful, intelligent women I know. Any man would be lucky to have you in his life." Sarah squeezed her mother's hands. "But I think you've convinced yourself that nobody could want you, so you don't even see when someone is interested." His eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" Sarah smiled gently. "Jake has found more reasons to visit our farm in the past month than in the previous 4 years combined. He doesn't need to come here personally to place orders. He has ranch hands who handle those kinds of errands, but somehow he keeps finding reasons to stop by and talk to you." The color in his cheeks deepened, and she shook her head. "Mister is just being neighborly. He's a good man who helps out local businesses." "Mom, he asks you about growing techniques that he already knows. He compliments your cooking every chance he gets. He always seems to time his visits for when you're most likely to be home." Sarah paused for effect. "And have you noticed how he looks at you?" Was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the mountains in the distance. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't matter. I come with too much baggage. I'm foreign, I'm older, I have responsibilities. Men like Jake don't get involved with women like me." Sarah felt a surge of protectiveness for her mother, mixed with frustration at the self-defeating thoughts that had taken root in her mind. "Mom, listen to me. You're not baggage. You're not a burden. You're a successful businesswoman who has built something beautiful here. You're kind and generous and strong. Any man who can't see that isn't worth your time." "But what if I'm wrong about Mister? What if I misread the situation and make things awkward? This is a small community, Sarah. I can't afford to make enemies or create uncomfortable situations." His voice carried genuine fear. "And what about you? You're still young, you have your whole life ahead of you. You don't need your mother complicating things by getting involved with someone." Sarah realized that her mother's fears went deeper than simple insecurity. Had spent so many years focused on survival and providing for her daughter that she had forgotten how to consider her own happiness. The idea of pursuing something for herself, something that might involve risk or vulnerability, seemed foreign and frightening. "Mom, I'm 26 years old. I want to see you happy. I want to know that when I eventually move on with my own life, you won't be sitting here alone, talking to the tomato plants because you don't have anyone else to talk to." Sarah's voice grew stronger with conviction. "And as for Jake, I think you're selling yourself short. I think you're exactly what a man like him has been looking for." Stood up from the bench, brushing soil from her hands. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, sweetheart, but some things are better left alone. Mister is a nice man, and I value his friendship and business. That's enough." As her mother walked toward the house, Sarah remained on the bench, watching the sun begin its descent behind the mountains. She knew her mother's fears weren't unreasonable. The ranching community could be traditional and insular, and had worked hard to earn the respect she now enjoyed. But Sarah also knew that her mother deserved more than respect and financial security. She deserved love and companionship, and someone who would appreciate all the wonderful things about her that she couldn't see in herself. That evening, as Sarah helped her mother prepare dinner, she made a decision that would change both their lives. If her mother was too afraid to take a chance on happiness, then Sarah would have to create an opportunity for truth to emerge. She would find a way to make sure Jake understood exactly how her mother felt about her prospects for love and companionship. The plan that began forming in Sarah's mind was risky and would require careful timing. But as she watched her mother move through their small kitchen, humming that same lonely lullaby, Sarah knew she had to try. Some chances were too important to leave to fate, and her mother's happiness was definitely one of them. The Valley Farmers Market took place every Saturday in the town square, a weekly gathering that served as much as a social event as a place of commerce. Vendors arrived before dawn to set up their stalls, and by 8 in the morning, the square buzzed with activity as ranchers, townspeople, and tourists browsed the offerings. Sarah had convinced her mother to expand their usual market presence, arguing that the late-season vegetables deserved better display space. In reality, Sarah had noticed that Jake made a point of walking through the market every Saturday morning, often stopping to buy coffee and pastries from the local bakery vendor. Arranged her produce with artistic precision, creating displays that looked more like abundant harvest paintings than simple vegetable stands. Her tomatoes were sorted by color and size, her herbs bundled with care, and her signature cucumber salad samples were arranged in small paper cups that disappeared as quickly as she could refill them. "Your mother certainly knows how to make vegetables look appealing," commented Williams, the elderly woman who ran the flower stand next to theirs. Had been watching the family with interest since they first appeared at the market 5 years ago, and she had become one of few close friends in the community. Sarah smiled while helping arrange bundles of fresh basil. "She has an artist's eye. She sees beauty in everything, including that handsome rancher who's been circling our section for the past 10 minutes. Raised an eyebrow and nodded toward Jake, who was indeed making his way slowly through the nearby stalls, stopping to examine products with unusual interest. Sarah's heart raced as she watched Jake approach. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, but she needed to time her words perfectly. Her mother was busy helping a customer select the best tomatoes for canning, completely unaware of Jake's presence. When Jake finally reached their stall, he greeted Sarah with his characteristic warm smile. "Morning, Sarah. Looks like you folks brought quite a selection today." "Good morning, mister. Mom's been working extra hard to bring the best of the late harvest to market." Sarah glanced around to make sure her mother was still occupied with her customer. "Can I ask you something personal?" Jake's expression grew more attentive. "Of course." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "What do you think of my mother? I mean, as a person, not just as a business partner." The question clearly caught Jake off guard. He looked toward who was now weighing vegetables for her customer, her face animated as she explained the best cooking methods for each item. When he turned back to Sarah, his expression was more serious. "Your mother is one of the finest people I've ever known," he said quietly. "She's built something remarkable here, and she's done it with grace and integrity. She treats everyone with respect, works harder than anyone has a right to expect, and somehow finds time to be generous and kind on top of everything else." Sarah studied Jake's face as he spoke, noting how his voice softened when he talked about her mother, how his eyes seemed to seek her out even during casual conversation. "Do you think she's attractive?" Jake's cheeks reddened slightly, and he cleared his throat. "Sarah, I'm not sure this is an appropriate conversation for us to be having." "Please, mister, I have my reasons for asking." Sarah glanced again at her mother, who was now chatting with about flower arrangements. "Do you find my mother attractive?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on as she laughed at something had said. When he finally answered, his voice carried a weight of honesty that surprised Sarah with its depth. "Your mother is one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen," he said simply. "But her beauty goes far beyond how she looks. She has a light in her that draws people to her, a strength that commands respect, and a gentleness that makes everyone around her feel valued." Sarah felt her heart skip with hope, but she pressed forward with the more difficult part of her plan. "Then why haven't you asked her out? Why do you keep finding business reasons to visit instead of just telling her how you feel?" Jake removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair, a gesture Sarah had noticed he made when he was thinking deeply about something. "It's complicated, Sarah. Your mother has been through a lot and she's built a good life here. I don't want to disrupt that or make her uncomfortable. What if I told you that she thinks no man would want her because she's a widow with a grown daughter? What if I told you that she believes she's too old and comes with too much baggage?" Sarah watched Jake's expression change as her words sank in. "What if I told you that she's convinced herself that a successful rancher like you would never be interested in someone like her?" Jake's face showed genuine surprise and something that might have been pain. "She really thinks that?" "She told me yesterday that men like you don't get involved with women like her. She thinks she's undesirable because of her circumstances." Sarah felt guilty for revealing her mother's private fears, but she could see that Jake needed to understand the barriers that existed in her mother's mind. "That's ridiculous," Jake said, his voice carrying a hint of anger that wasn't directed at Sarah. "Your mother is. She's everything any man could want in a partner. She's intelligent, beautiful, kind. The fact that she has a grown daughter isn't a burden, it's a testament to what a good mother she is. Sarah smiled at the passion in Jake's voice. Then why don't you tell her that instead of telling me? Before Jake could respond, approached their conversation, her customer having departed with bags full of vegetables. Mister, how nice to see you today. Are you looking for anything in particular? Sarah watched the transformation that came over both adults when they were in each other's presence. Her mother's posture straightened, her voice became slightly softer, and her movements seemed more graceful. Jake, for his part, seemed to stand a little taller, his voice grew warmer, and his usual serious expression relaxed into something approaching contentment. Actually, Mrs., I was hopping to talk to you about something beyond business, if you have a moment. Jake's voice carried a nervous quality that Sarah had never heard before. Glanced at Sarah, who was making a show of rearranging herb bundles while clearly listening to every word. Of course, what can I help you with? Jake looked around the busy market square, seeming to realize that this was perhaps not the ideal location for a personal conversation. Would it be possible to speak privately? Maybe we could walk over to the coffee stand. Sarah saw her mother hesitate, uncertainty flickering across her face. Sarah, can you watch the stall for a few minutes? Take as long as you need, Mom. Can help if I get overwhelmed. Sarah tried to keep her voice casual while internally celebrating this development. As Sarah watched her mother and Jake walk away together, she felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. She had set something in motion, but she couldn't control where it would lead. Moved closer to the stall, pretending to help rearrange flowers while obviously keeping an eye on the couple by the coffee stand. You know, said quietly, I've been watching that man look at your mother for months. He gets the same expression on his face that my late husband used to get when he looked at me. What kind of expression? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Like she's the most fascinating thing in the world, like he can't quite believe his good fortune in being able to talk to her. Smiled knowingly. That's the look of a man in love, honey. The question is whether your mother is ready to see it. Sarah followed gaze to where her mother and Jake stood beside the coffee vendor's cart. Even from a distance, she could see that they were engaged in serious conversation. Jake was speaking earnestly, using hand gestures that suggested he was trying to explain something important. Her mother was listening intently, her head tilted slightly in the way she always held it when she was giving someone her complete attention. Mister is a good man, continued. He was married young to a woman who never really took to ranch life. She left him after about 10 years, moved back east to be closer to her family. That was more than 15 years ago, and he's been alone ever since. This was information Sarah hadn't known, and it helped explain some of Jake's apparent hesitation. He's been single for 15 years. He dated some over the years, but nothing serious. I think he got pretty careful about getting involved with someone who might not understand the demands of ranch life. Glanced at Sarah meaningfully. Your mother, of course, understands hard work and rural living better than most. As they watched, Jake and's conversation seemed to become more intense. Sarah could see her mother's hands moving as she spoke, a sign that she was explaining something that mattered to her. Jake was listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was hearing things that surprised him. Then something shifted in their body language. Her mother stepped back slightly, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture Sarah recognized as defensive. Jake reached out as if to touch her arm, then seemed to think better of it and let his hand fall back to his side. Uh-oh, murmured. That doesn't look like it's going well. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she watched her mother shake her head repeatedly while Jake continued to speak. Whatever he was saying seemed to be causing her distress rather than happiness. After another minute of conversation, turned and walked quickly back toward their stall, leaving Jake standing alone by the coffee cart. When her mother reached the vegetable stand, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes seemed overly bright. She immediately began rearranging displays that didn't need rearranging, her movements sharp and agitated. Mom, what happened? Sarah asked gently. Nothing happened. Mister had some ideas about business arrangements that I don't think will work out. His voice was tight with controlled emotion. We should start packing up. The morning rush is over. Sarah glanced back toward the coffee stand and saw Jake still standing there, his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had just received unexpected and unwelcome news. Whatever conversation had just taken place, It clearly hadn't gone the way either of them had hoped. "Mom, what kind of business arrangements?" Sarah pressed, though she suspected the conversation had been about anything but business. "It doesn't matter, Sarah. Some things are better left as they are," continued her aggressive reorganizing, clearly signaling that the subject was closed. But Sarah could see the pain in her mother's movements, the way she held her shoulders as if bracing against disappointment. Whatever Jake had said, it had somehow confirmed her mother's worst fears about her desirability and prospects. The plan Sarah had set in motion with such hope was apparently backfiring in ways she hadn't anticipated. As they packed up their remaining vegetables, Sarah caught glimpses of Jake slowly making his way back through the market. He stopped to talk to a few other vendors, but his usual easy manner seemed forced, and he kept glancing in their direction with an expression that looked like regret. The drive home was uncomfortably quiet, with responding to Sarah's attempts at conversation with single-word answers. It wasn't until they were unloading the truck at their farm that Sarah's mother finally spoke about what had happened. "Sarah, I need you to promise me something," said without looking up from the boxes of leftover vegetables. "I need you to promise that you won't interfere in my personal life anymore." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Finally looked at her daughter, and Sarah was shocked to see tears in her eyes. "Mister told me about your conversation with him this morning, about the questions you asked him." Sarah felt heat flood her face as she realized the extent of her mistake. In her eagerness to help, she had violated her mother's privacy and dignity in a way that couldn't be undone. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was just trying to help." "I know you meant well, sweetheart, but asking a man if he finds your mother attractive, sharing my private fears and insecurities with someone I have to do business with, do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" His voice cracked with emotion. "Now every time I see Mister, I'll know that he knows exactly how pathetic and desperate I really am." The pain in her mother's voice made Sarah's chest ache with guilt and regret. She had been so focused on the potential for happiness that she hadn't considered how her interference might affect her mother's sense of dignity and self-respect. "What did he say to you, Mom?" Sarah asked quietly. Wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that made her look younger and more vulnerable than Sarah had seen her in years. "He was very kind, very respectful. He told me that he thinks highly of me and that he hopes we can continue to be friends and business partners." The word friends carried a weight of finality that told Sarah everything she needed to know about how the conversation had ended. Whatever Jake had felt or thought he felt, her interference had somehow made it impossible for him to act on it. As they finished unloading in silence, Sarah realized that her well-intentioned meddling had potentially destroyed her mother's chance at happiness with the one man who seemed to truly appreciate her. The question now was whether the damage could be repaired, or if she had permanently complicated her mother's relationship with the best man in Valley. 3 weeks passed after the farmer's market incident, and the atmosphere around the farm had grown heavy with unspoken regret. Threw herself into her work with an intensity that worried Sarah, rising before dawn to tend gardens that were already pristine, and staying up late to prepare preserves and pickled vegetables for the restaurants that depended on her supply. Jake's weekly visits had stopped entirely. Instead, he sent ranch hands to pick up orders, always with polite messages about his busy schedule and appreciation for the quality of the vegetables. The absence of his presence felt like a weight in the house, though neither woman spoke about it directly. Sarah watched her mother move through each day with a determined cheerfulness that felt forced and fragile. Sang while she worked, but the songs were different now, missing the unconscious joy that had characterized her music before. She spoke brightly to customers and neighbors, but Sarah noticed how her smiles never quite reached her eyes. The guilt Sarah carried grew heavier with each passing day. She had wanted to help her mother find happiness, but instead she had destroyed something precious before it had a chance to develop. The knowledge that her interference had cost her mother a potential relationship with a good man made every interaction between them feel strained and careful. On a particularly cold October morning, Sarah was helping her mother harvest the last of the winter squash when Williams drove up in her ancient pickup truck. Had been stopping by more frequently since the market incident, bringing flowers and gossip in equal measure, and Sarah suspected the older woman was keeping an eye on them both. "Morning, ladies," called out as she approached the garden, carrying a large bouquet of late-season chrysanthemums. Thought you might like some flowers to brighten up the kitchen table. Accepted the flowers with genuine pleasure, burying her nose in the blooms and inhaling their earthy scent. These are beautiful. Thank you for thinking of us. Actually, I have an ulterior motive, admitted with a sly smile. I need help with something, and you two are the only people I trust to give me honest advice. Sarah looked up from the squash she was loading into baskets, curious about what kind of advice might need. The older woman was known throughout the valley for her practical wisdom and self-sufficiency. "What can we help you with?" asked, leading them toward the house where they could talk more comfortably. Once they were settled in the kitchen with cups of tea and slices of homemade apple bread, launched into what seemed like a carefully rehearsed story. "It's about my nephew, Bobby. You remember him. He visited last summer and helped me rebuild my greenhouse." Stirred honey into her tea with unusual concentration. "Well, he's been having some troubles with romance, and I thought maybe you could give me some insight into the female perspective." Sarah exchanged a glance with her mother, both of them remembering Bobby as a sweet but somewhat awkward young man in his early 30s who had seemed completely devoted to his plants and tools. "Of course, if we can help," replied cautiously. Nodded and launched into her tale. "Bobby has been interested in a woman for months, but he's convinced himself that she's out of his league. She's older than him, more educated, more sophisticated. She owns her own business and seems to have her life completely together." Sarah began to sense where this conversation might be heading, and she felt a flutter of both hope and apprehension in her chest. "The thing is," continued, "Bobby finally worked up the courage to tell this woman how he feels about her. But when he approached her, she became very upset and told him she wasn't interested in any kind of romantic relationship." Set down her teacup with a small click. "That must have been very disappointing for him." It was, but here's the confusing part. Bobby later found out that this woman had been telling people that she was too old and set in her ways for romance, that she came with too much baggage and couldn't understand why any man would want to get involved with someone in her situation. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Sarah watched her mother's face carefully, seeing recognition and something that might have been pain flicker across her features. "What I can't figure out," continued with apparent innocence, "is how a woman could believe she's undesirable while a good man is standing right there telling her she's everything he's been looking for." Stood up abruptly and moved to the window, her back to the table. "Sometimes people protect themselves by assuming the worst. It's easier to believe you're not wanted than to risk being rejected." "But what if the rejection is based on a misunderstanding?" Pressed gently. "What if the man never actually rejected her at all?" Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she started to understand what was really saying. "What do you mean?" Looked directly at Sarah, and her expression became more serious. What if the woman was so convinced that the man couldn't possibly want her that she interpreted his kindness and respect as polite rejection? Turned from the window, her face pale. "What are you really trying to tell us?" The older woman sighed and abandoned her pretense entirely. "Jake has been driving me crazy for 3 weeks. He comes to buy flowers he doesn't need and talks my ear off about how he misunderstood everything and probably ruined his only chance with the most wonderful woman he's ever met." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs as the truth of the situation began to dawn on her. "What exactly did he say happened at the market?" "He said he tried to tell you how much he cared about you, but that you seemed distressed by his feelings. He said you told him you valued his friendship and hoped he would understand that you weren't looking for anything more complicated than business partnership." Sank back into her chair, her hand pressed to her throat in the defensive gesture Sarah knew so well. "But I never said. I mean, I thought he was being polite. I thought he was trying to let me down easy." Leaned forward with the intensity of someone finally able to deliver important information. "Honey, that man has been in love with you for months. He told me he's never felt about anyone the way he feels about you. The only reason he didn't pursue you more directly was because he was afraid of making you uncomfortable or pressuring you into something you didn't want." Sarah watched her mother's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been hope. "But he knows about my situation, about my age, about Sarah." "And he doesn't care about any of that," said firmly. "In fact, he told me specifically that he thinks any man would be lucky to be part of your family. He said Sarah is obviously a wonderful young woman, which speaks to what kind of mother you are." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of quiet crying. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with the release of weeks of suppressed emotion. "I was so sure," she whispered through her tears. "I was so convinced that he was just being kind because he felt sorry for me." Sarah reached across the table to take her mother's hand. "Mom, I think we both misunderstood what happened that day." Nodded knowingly. "Jake said he tried to tell you how much he admired you and how he'd been hoping you might be interested in spending time together outside of business. He said when you stepped back and seemed upset, he assumed you were horrified by the idea and tried to reassure you that he would never pressure you. And I thought he was trying to tell me politely that he could never see me as anything more than a business partner," said, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. "I thought when he mentioned friendship, he was making sure I knew not to expect anything else." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. If was right, then the situation wasn't as hopeless as she had thought. But it also meant that both her mother and Jake had spent 3 weeks believing they had been rejected by someone who actually cared about them. "What should we do?" Sarah asked, feeling out of her depth when it came to adult romance. "Well," said with a smile that suggested she had given this considerable thought, "it seems to me that this situation calls for some honest communication between two adults who have been talking past each other." Shook her head immediately. "I can't face him again knowing how I misunderstood everything. He must think I'm a complete fool." "He thinks he's a complete fool," countered. "He's convinced himself that he came on too strong and scared you off. He's been beating himself up for weeks about pushing someone he cares about into an uncomfortable situation." Sarah looked between the two older women, seeing the solution clearly even if they couldn't. "You both need to talk to each other. Really talk, without assumptions or fear or trying to protect each other from uncomfortable truths." "It's not that simple, sweetheart," said, though her voice carried less conviction than it had in weeks. Stood up and moved toward the door with the purposeful stride of someone who had accomplished what she came to do. "Actually, it might be simpler than you think. Jake's been looking for an excuse to come by and check on you both. He's worried that his conversation with you upset you, and he wants to make sure you're all right." Said with a note of warning in her voice, "Please don't interfere the way Sarah did. I couldn't handle another misunderstanding." "I'm not going to interfere," said innocently. "I'm just going to mention that you've seemed a little sad lately and that maybe a friendly visit might cheer you up." As drove away, leaving behind the scent of chrysanthemums and the promise of renewed possibility, Sarah watched her mother struggle with hope and fear in equal measure. The knowledge that Jake might actually care for her was clearly both wonderful and terrifying. "Mom," Sarah said gently, "what if's right? What if Jake has been feeling just as confused and rejected as you have?" Was quiet for a long time, staring out at the garden where the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the rows of winter vegetables. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality Sarah hadn't heard in weeks. "I suppose," she said slowly, "that if I'm going to make a fool of myself, I'd rather do it honestly than continue to hide from the truth." Sarah felt a surge of pride for her mother's courage, mixed with anxiety about what might happen next. The situation was far from resolved, but for the first time since the farmers' market incident, there seemed to be reason for hope. As evening approached and they prepared dinner together, both women kept glancing toward the window that faced the road, waiting for the sound of a familiar truck engine that might announce the arrival of answers to questions they had been afraid to ask. Jake arrived at the farm just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Sarah of her mother's favorite roses. She watched from the kitchen window as his truck turned into their driveway, moving slowly as if he was giving himself time to change his mind. Was in the garden, cutting the last of the herbs before the first hard frost that was predicted for that night. She moved among the plants with quiet efficiency, but Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the road as if she was expecting something she wasn't sure she was ready for. When Jake climbed out of his truck, he stood for a moment looking toward the garden where worked. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the uncertainty in his posture, the way he held his hat in his hands like a man preparing for difficult news. He was wearing his good shirt, she noticed, the blue one that brought out his eyes and made him look younger than his 52 years. Sarah made a quick decision. Instead of calling out to announce Jake's arrival, She slipped out the back door and made her way to where her mother was gathering basil with intense concentration. "Mom," she said quietly, "Jake's here." His hands stilled in their work, and she looked up with eyes that held equal measures of hope and terror. "What should I do?" "Talk to him," Sarah said simply. "Tell him the truth about what you thought he meant that day at the market. Ask him what he really came to say. What if was wrong? What if he really was just trying to be kind?" His voice carried the weight of 3 weeks' worth of doubt and self-protection. Sarah reached out to touch her mother's arm gently. "Then at least you'll know for sure. But Mom, what if she was right? What if you've both been miserable for weeks over a misunderstanding that could be fixed with one honest conversation?" Stood up slowly, brushing soil from her hands and smoothing her hair in the unconscious gesture of a woman preparing to face something important. "I don't know how to do this, Sarah. I don't know how to risk my heart again." "You don't have to risk everything at once," Sarah assured her. "Just risk enough to tell the truth and hear the truth in return." As they walked toward the front of the house, Sarah could see Jake packing near his truck, clearly gathering his own courage for whatever conversation he had come to have. When he saw them approaching, he straightened and moved toward them with the careful steps of a man walking across uncertain ground. "Mrs. Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed forced. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I wanted to check on you both and make sure everything was all right." Sarah looked between the two adults, both of whom seemed to be waiting for the other to speak first, both clearly struggling with words that felt too important to get wrong. "Actually, mister," Sarah said, making another quick decision, "I need to go inside and start dinner. Mom, why don't you show Mister the winter garden while there's still light?" Before either of them could protest, Sarah retreated to the house, leaving them standing together in the gathering dusk with nothing but truth between them. From the kitchen window, Sarah could see them walking slowly toward the garden, maintaining a careful distance that spoke of their mutual uncertainty. She watched her mother point out the winter vegetables that would survive the frost, saw Jake nod and respond, both of them clearly talking about anything other than what they had really come together to discuss. It was who finally broke through the careful politeness. Sarah saw her mother stop walking and turn to face Jake directly, her posture straightening with the resolve Sarah recognized from every other time her mother had decided to confront something difficult. Sarah couldn't hear the words from her position in the house, but she could see the conversation intensify. Her mother's hands moved as she spoke, a sign that she was explaining something that mattered deeply to her. Jake listened with complete attention, his own body language shifting from formal politeness to something more open and vulnerable. Then Jake began to speak, and Sarah watched her mother's expression change from defensive explanation to surprised understanding. Her mother's hand moved to her throat in that familiar protective gesture, but this time it seemed less about defense and more about absorbing unexpected information. The conversation continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah saw Jake reach out tentatively, then let his hand fall back to his side. She saw her mother step closer, then stop as if unsure whether she was welcome. They were both clearly struggling with the gap between wanting to bridge the distance between them and not knowing how. Then something shifted. Jake said something that made look up at him with an expression Sarah had never seen on her mother's face, a mixture of wonder and disbelief and cautious joy. He reached out again, more deliberately this time, and touched her mother's hand. This time didn't step back. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched her mother allow Jake to take her hand, saw them move closer together as whatever barriers had stood between them began to dissolve. The conversation that followed seemed gentler, punctuated by small gestures of connection that spoke of understanding finally achieved. When they finally turned to walk back toward the house, they were walking closer together, not quite touching, but no longer maintaining the careful distance that had characterized their interactions for weeks. Both of their faces carried expressions of relief and something that looked very much like happiness. Sarah quickly moved away from the window and herself with dinner preparations, wanting to give them privacy to process whatever understanding they had reached. When they entered the kitchen together, the change in atmosphere was immediately apparent. The tension that had hung over the house for weeks seemed to have lifted, replaced by something warmer and more hopeful. "Sarah," her mother said, and her voice carried a quality of lightness that had been missing for too long. Mister has explained some things to me about our conversation at the market. Jake looked slightly embarrassed but determined. It seems we both misunderstood what the other was trying to say that day. Sarah felt a rush of relief and curiosity. What actually happened? And Jake exchanged a look that held newfound understanding and shared amusement at their mutual confusion. I was trying to tell your mother that I had feelings for her and hoped she might be interested in spending time together, Jake explained. But when she seemed distressed, I assumed she was uncomfortable with my interest and tried to reassure her that I would never pressure her. And I thought he was trying to tell me politely that he could only see me as a friend and business partner, added. When he mentioned valuing our friendship, I thought he was making sure I understood not to expect anything more. Sarah shook her head at the complexity of adult miscommunication. So you were both trying to protect each other from uncomfortable feelings that you actually shared. Something like that, Jake said with a rueful smile, though it took Williams to help us figure it out. Moved to the stove to check on the dinner that had been simmering while they talked. Told us both that we were being foolish in her own diplomatic way. She's right, Jake said, his voice growing more serious. I've been foolish about a lot of things, but mostly about being too afraid to tell you how I really feel. Sarah watched her mother turn from the stove to face Jake, her expression open and vulnerable in a way that spoke of walls finally coming down. How do you really feel? Asked quietly. Jake's answer came without hesitation. I think you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known. I admire your strength and your kindness and your intelligence. I love watching you work in your garden and listening to you talk about your plans and dreams. I think any man would be incredibly fortunate to be part of your life. The words hung in the kitchen air like a promise, and Sarah felt her heart swell with happiness for her mother, who was hearing the affirmation she had convinced herself she would never receive. And what about my circumstances? Asked, though her voice carried less fear than it had in weeks. My age, my responsibilities, the fact that I come with a grown daughter and a complicated history. Jake's expression grew more tender. Your circumstances are part of what makes you who you are. Sarah is a wonderful young woman, which tells me everything I need to know about what kind of mother you are. Your history shows me that you're capable of loyalty and resilience and building something beautiful even after loss. Sarah felt tears threatening again as she watched her mother absorb these words, saw the disbelief in her eyes slowly give way to acceptance. As for your age, Jake continued with a slight smile, you're 8 years younger than me, which hardly makes you an old woman, and your responsibilities show me that you're someone who takes care of the people and things that matter to you. Was quiet for a long moment, processing this different perspective on the things she had considered obstacles to love. I've been so afraid, she admitted finally. After losing Sarah's father, I convinced myself that I had used up my chance at love, that it would be selfish to want more than just safety and security. Love isn't selfish, Jake said gently. And you deserve so much more than just safety and security. You deserve someone who appreciates everything wonderful about you. Sarah quietly excused herself from the kitchen, understanding that her mother and Jake needed time to navigate this new understanding between them. As she left, she heard her mother ask quietly, "What happens now?" And Jake's response carried all the promise of new beginnings. Now we take things one day at a time and see where this leads us, if you're willing to give me that chance. From her bedroom, Sarah could hear the quiet murmur of continued conversation, punctuated by her mother's laughter for the first time in weeks. Whatever specific plans they were making, it was clear that the barriers of misunderstanding had finally been cleared away, leaving room for something real and hopeful to grow. 6 months later, the farm had transformed into something that felt more like home than it ever had before. The spring garden was flourishing under the combined care of Jake, who had developed a partnership that extended far beyond vegetables into a collaboration of hearts and dreams. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching her mother and Jake work together to build new raised beds for the expanding herb garden. Their movements had the easy synchronization of people who had learned to anticipate each other's needs, and their quiet conversation was punctuated by laughter that carried across the yard like music. The changes had come gradually, in ways both large and small. Jake had started joining them for dinner twice a week, bringing stories from the ranch and a masculine energy that balanced the peaceful femininity that had characterized their household. He fixed things without being asked, offered opinions that were valued rather than resented, and treated both women with a respect that felt natural rather than careful. More importantly, he had brought out a side of that Sarah had never seen before. Her mother had always been capable and strong, but with Jake, she also allowed herself to be soft, to be taken care of, to share both her worries and her dreams with someone who understood the challenges of rural life. The formal courtship that had begun that October evening had progressed with the patience of people who understood that the best things were worth waiting for. Jake had courted with an old-fashioned thoughtfulness that included flowers picked from his own property, long walks through both their lands, and conversations that stretched late into the evening. Sarah had watched their relationship develop with a mixture of joy and amazement. Her mother bloomed under Jake's attention like a plant that had been waiting for the right combination of sun and water. The worry lines around her eyes softened, her laughter came more easily, and she began making plans that extended beyond mere survival into hopes for a fuller future. For his part, Jake had revealed depths that his somewhat serious public demeanor had never suggested. He was funny in a dry, understated way that made giggle like a teenager. He was thoughtful, remembering small details about her preferences and dreams. And he was clearly, completely smitten with both as a woman and with the life she had built for herself and her daughter. The proposal had come in March, during the first warm evening of spring, when the three of them were sitting on the porch watching the stars emerge over the mountains. Jake had been unusually quiet during dinner, and Sarah had noticed him touching his shirt pocket repeatedly, as if checking on something hidden there. He had said finally, his voice carrying a nervous quality that was unusual for him, "I have something I want to ask you." Sarah had started to excuse herself, but Jake had stopped her with a gentle smile. "Sarah, I'd like you to stay for this. What I want to ask affects you too." He had turned to face directly, taking her hands in his roughened ones. "I know we haven't been together very long by traditional standards, but I'm 52 years old, and I know what I want. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing I get to see your face and hear your voice. I want to help you with your gardens and your dreams, and I want you to help me with mine." Sarah had watched her mother's face transform with wonder as Jake continued speaking. "I want to be part of this family you and Sarah have built together. I want to be someone you can depend on, someone who takes care of you the way you've been taking care of everyone else." He had reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant ring that caught the starlight. "Will you marry me? Will you let me love you for the rest of our lives?" The yes that came from her mother's lips was barely audible, but the joy that lit up her face was visible from space. As Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah had felt a completion she hadn't even realized she was waiting for. Now, watching them work together in the spring sunshine, Sarah marveled at how natural their partnership seemed. Jake had seamlessly integrated into their routines and their plans. The ranch hands who came to pick up vegetables now often stayed to chat with about recipes and growing tips. Jake's friends and neighbors had welcomed her mother into their social circle with a warmth that spoke to the respect they had for Jake's judgment. The wedding was planned for June, a small ceremony in the garden they had built together, followed by a reception in Jake's ranch house that would mark the beginning of their merged lives. Sarah would keep the original farm as her own project, while would move to the ranch and expand her growing operation with access to Jake's larger property and resources. But perhaps the most beautiful change was visible in the small moments of everyday life. Sarah saw it in the way her mother sang while she cooked, in how she laughed more easily, in the confidence that had replaced the careful self-protection that had characterized her behavior for so long. Jake brought her mother coffee in the morning and listened to her plans for the day with genuine interest. He asked her opinion about ranch decisions and valued her practical wisdom. He had learned to cook some of her favorite Vietnamese dishes and surprised her with small gifts that showed how carefully he paid attention to her preferences. Most importantly, he had given her mother something Sarah had not been able to provide: the security of knowing she was valued not just for what she could do or provide, but for who she was as a person. "Sarah," her mother called from the garden, interrupting her reverie, "could you bring us some of that iced tea?" As Sarah prepared the drinks, she reflected on the conversation that had started this entire journey. Her admission that her mother drew no suitors had been born from worry and frustration, but it had led to a truth that neither of them could have anticipated. When she brought the tea outside, she found Jake and her mother sitting on the wooden bench her father had built years ago. head resting on Jake's shoulder as they surveyed their work. "Your mother tells me you're thinking about applying to graduate school," Jake said, accepting his glass with a grateful smile. Sarah nodded, still somewhat amazed by how easily Jake had stepped into a parental role that felt supportive rather than intrusive. "I've been looking at programs in agricultural business. I think there's a lot of potential to expand what Mom has built here." "That's a wonderful idea," Jake said. "And you know you'll always have a place here, whether you decide to expand the farm operation or take things in a different direction entirely." The casual way he included her in future plans, the assumption that she would always be part of their family structure, had been one of the many gifts of Jake's presence in their lives. Sarah had worried that her mother's marriage might somehow diminish her own place in life, but Jake had made it clear from the beginning that he saw Sarah not as an obstacle, but as a blessing. "Jake's been talking about maybe adding some livestock to complement the vegetable operation," said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had rediscovered the pleasure of planning for the future. "Chickens for eggs, maybe some goats for milk and cheese. The restaurant owners I know are always looking for local sources for dairy and eggs," Jake added. "It could be a natural expansion of what you've already built." Sarah listened to them discuss possibilities with a contentment she hadn't felt in years. Her mother was not just surviving anymore, she was thriving. She was making plans that stretched years into the future, confident that she would have a partner to share both the work and the rewards. As the afternoon faded into evening, the three of them moved to the porch to watch the sunset over the mountains. Jake sat with tucked against his side, while Sarah occupied her father's old rocking chair, feeling the presence of all the love that had shaped this place. "Sarah," her mother said quietly, "do you remember what you said to me about drawing no suitors?" Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment at the memory of her clumsy attempts at matchmaking. "I remember saying some things I probably shouldn't have said." Jake chuckled softly. "Actually, I'm grateful for your interference, even if it caused some confusion at first. If you hadn't pushed your mother to consider the possibility, and if you hadn't asked me those pointed questions, we might have spent years dancing around each other without ever understanding what we both wanted." Reached over to take Sarah's hand. "You were right that I had convinced myself I was undesirable. You were right that I was settling for less than I deserved. You were even right that Jake was interested in more than just buying vegetables." "I was wrong about a lot of things too," Sarah admitted. "I should have trusted you both to handle your own feelings without my interference." "Maybe," Jake said thoughtfully, "but sometimes people need a little push to see past their own fears and assumptions. Your mother and I were both so busy protecting ourselves and each other that we almost missed something wonderful." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah thought about the conversation that had started everything. Her mother's belief that she drew no suitors had been based on fear and self-doubt, but it had also been a cry for reassurance and hope. Jake's response to that cry had been everything her mother needed to hear: that her supposed disadvantages were actually strengths, that her age and circumstances and responsibilities were not obstacles to love, but evidence of her character and worth. "All the better," Jake had said when told him about fears. "All the better that she comes with depth and experience and wisdom. All the better that she has a daughter who loves her enough to worry about her happiness. All the better that she's built something meaningful with her life." The ranch lights began to twinkle in the distance as Jake prepared to drive home, a journey that would soon end when they married, and he would stay each night instead of leaving. Sarah watched him kiss her mother goodbye, a gesture so natural and right that it was hard to remember a time when it hadn't been part of their evening routine. As his truck disappeared down the road, came to sit on the porch steps beside Sarah's chair. "Are you happy, Mom?" Sarah asked, though the answer was written in the peaceful expression on her mother's face. "I'm more than happy," replied. "I'm grateful for you for pushing me to see possibilities I had closed myself off to. Grateful for Jake, for seeing value in things I thought made me undesirable. Grateful for this life we've all built together." Sarah felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her mother's happiness was secure, that the loneliness and self-doubt that had characterized her life for so long had been replaced by love and partnership and hope for the future. The conversation about drawing no suitors had begun with Sarah's worried observation about her mother's isolation. It was ending with the recognition that the right person had been waiting all along, ready to appreciate not just her mother's beauty and kindness, but all the complex realities of her life. Jake had indeed replied, all the better, to every concern about circumstances. All the better that she was experienced and wise. All the better that she came with a daughter who cared about her happiness. All the better that she had built a successful business and an independent life. In the end, Jake wanted not some idealized version of a woman, but exactly who was. A strong, capable, loving person who had survived loss and built something beautiful from the pieces of her life. The fact that no other suitors had pursued her said nothing about her worth, and everything about their failure to recognize what was right in front of them. As Sarah and her mother sat together in the peaceful darkness, listening to the night sounds of their valley and planning for a future that now included love and partnership and shared dreams, Sarah realized that her worry about her mother drawing no suitors had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Hadn't failed to draw suitors because she was lacking in any way. She had simply been waiting, unknowingly, for the right man to see past surface concerns to the remarkable woman underneath. Jake had been worth waiting for, and their love story was just beginning.